Light your favorite candle. Close your eyes. Picture what you're looking for. While it burns, do you see it? Do you see it? Take a deep breath. Count to 8. Concentrate on manifesting whatever it is that you need right now. That you need right now.
Oh, yes.
Hello.
Perfect. Thank
Great.
you.
Very good.
Lisa, Jar Jar Binks.
That's
Don't.
that's the worst accent to know how to do, is it?
It is.
Yeah.
Because no one wants to hear that.
No one wants to hear it. It was racist when they did it.
Exactly. It's horrible.
And that guy is suicidal now because of it, you know?
The Jar Jar Binks guy?
Oh, yeah. You don't know about him?
Is he like depressed because of
Yes.
the Jar Jar
It
Binks?
sent him into like 10 years of depression after
Oh
after 05 when the last one was released. He was like, shit,
Well,
That's horrible.
That's horrible.
That's
those
horrible.
movies are a shit show.
I mean,
No, look, movies can be bad, and I will bag on bad movies till the end of time, but, like, it's just a fucking movie, people. Like, leave the
Right.
actors alone.
Leave
It's not
the
his
actors
fault.
alone. Exactly.
It's not his fault. He was doing exactly what George Lucas asked him
it's
to do.
George Lucas. Get mad at George Lucas, but also don't get mad at George Lucas. Don't get mad. Just be like, it's
Well-
bad. Shit. Should we start this podcast? Let's start this podcast.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for joining us.
Hello, thanks for
Scotty
having
Villhard.
me.
Yes. Introduce yourself. Talk about your
Hello.
relation to the subject.
Yeah, I'm Scotty. I'm Jack's sibling. I am studying film, specifically screenwriting in Austin, Texas right now, and I'm a musician as well. I'm a big fan of folk music, especially the subgenre of folk punk, and that's my connection with the genre.
Yeah,
and
nice.
with one of the co-hosts.
and to the co-host. And I'm Jack Villhard, and this is Luke Miller.
Yeah, we're kind of like distant brothers, you know?
Yeah, but we're not brothers.
We're not brothers, though.
That's the name of the podcast. Gotta plug it. Gotta plug the name.
So would this make Luke and I like brothers out of law?
I thought I'd start off by talking about, because we first started our conversation about folk and why we wanted to get you in on this, because your range of knowledge over folk music is far beyond ours. Being a
It's
writer,
extremely specific, and it goes like it's like snakes. You know, I have no breadth of knowledge, right? I do not have any wide knowledge. I have a lot of very specific
That's
knowledge.
perfect.
Of
No, that's
several
great.
things.
That's all you need for a podcast, Scotty.
A locus of focus is good.
But
And you know, you listen to some podcasts, you don't even need that.
you listen exactly.
That's true.
But what started our conversation was just this idea of us trying to compare this artist. What's the name of the artist?
All right, so I just pulled it up. It's Kevin Morby, and his new album is Sundowner. And then the song
Sundowner.
was Valley that I sent you.
Kevin
Valley,
Morby,
yes.
yeah, you
Yeah.
sent me that guy.
And you sent me Valley,
And then the entire album, actually.
and you sent me the entire
Great album, by the way.
and I loved it, and I loved the
plug it.
song Sundowner, and I
Yeah.
sent it to you, Scotty, and Luke sent it to me. First off, starting off by saying he sounded like Daniel Johnston,
Can you agree with that
which
assessment?
is
a little?
No.
so
Oh, he says
wrong.
No, he didn't. Not
at
even
all.
not even
Not
a
even
little bit.
bit.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I
I'm
listened to this
sorry.
much Daniel Johnson, so I mean, it's like...
You watched a whole documentary about it, but it's fine.
Yeah, I know.
We'll be fine.
Mhm.
But so we got into a little bit of a discussion, and he was like, and you were quick to be like, oh yeah, you're probably right. He's not really like Daniel Johnston. You were
Yeah.
thinking more lyrically, and you were thinking more about the type of lyrics he was writing, how it's more poetic, and how it's a little bit more like, I would almost say like raw poetry, in that it was very to the point, but still not complete sentence structures. Which I don't think necessarily constitutes as folk, but I just is kind of what Daniel Johnston does, and a little bit of what this guy did.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I said he sounds a little bit more to me like Bob Dylan or the Fleet Foxes, to where I talked to you and you said
I said Fleet Foxes.
You said
it's
Fleet
not.
Foxes.
Fleet Foxes.
I'm not even that familiar with Fleet Foxes, but I'm very familiar with Bob Dylan.
Right.
It sounds like
yeah.
Bob Dylan.
and then you sent me what's his name and what's the album.
Brian McPherson. It was, what is that album called?
It's like American Boy, American Girl.
American Boy, American Girl.
Yes.
Great album.
American Boy, American Girl, a great album, an absolutely great album. I started listening to the whole thing actually. After you sent it
Great,
to me.
right?
Oh, it's
surprising.
So good.
It's like you go in and you're like, okay, this guy's doing Bob Dylan, and he does do Bob Dylan, but Bob Dylan doesn't do Bob Dylan anymore. So it's kind of nice to have someone who does Bob
Right.
Dylan.
Well, and
speaking of Bob Dylan, have you guys heard his latest album? I think it's
I couldn't. I
Really?
tried.
What?
I didn't like it.
Oh,
What do you think of it?
I didn't like it at all.
I mean, I have like this much of knowledge on Bob Dylan. Like I'm holding up the small fingers.
Well,
I thought it was good,
Mhm.
but I haven't like listened to his entire discography to compare it with. You know, so
I'm sure in like a certain perspective, in like honestly, here's the thing, it might be amazing. It could be an incredible album. I
critics
just
have
don't
it as
like
his
it.
fifth
No,
best
yeah.
album,
Right?
they said it was his 5th best album.
and I'm like
critics said.
floored by that. Like, wow.
You know what?
For Bob
you know
Dylan?
what? There's like 3 or 4 Bob Dylan albums I really like.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
if all the other ones that I haven't heard are shit, then maybe it is the fifth
Empire
best Bob
Burlesque.
Dylan album. I don't know.
Empire Burlesque 1985. Yeah.
If you approach it from like an art music perspective, it probably is. The issue is like I was listening to some of the songs I started on the album. I didn't even get all the way through it because the songs he didn't sound good. The rhythms I wasn't getting me in it. I wasn't hooking on
Well,
to it. I was like, you know
talk
what?
to me about why that is, because I have a question as well, and this kind of
Hit
goes
me,
into
yeah.
another thing, and it's quite the question I had is where does folk live now in the mainstream, and from that I'm gonna say someone who's never heard Bob Dylan before, maybe someone coming into him fresh, this being the first album he listened to, might as well say, oh well, this is amazing. Right, so knowing what someone's done versus what they're currently doing is a little bit different. But what is folk now in the mainstream? And I know there are still people doing folk punk, and people doing things like Bob Dylan, like we just talked about. American Boy, American Girl, that album. But what has folk been to the avid like radio listener right now?
Yeah, so most of the folk that I really like is not gonna end up in the realm of popular music and the realm of radio just because they're very small artists.
Yeah.
But there are some that do. And the interesting thing I think is that Bob Dylan actively rejects the label of folk artist.
Really?
A lot of people apply it to Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan says he is not a folk artist.
What does he say he is?
A musician, a singer-songwriter, I think. Maybe like rock. I'd honestly
Is he one
probably
of those
Bob Dylan's
musicians
like folk
who's like,
rock.
I am my own creation.
I don't know if he'd say he's his own genre, but like he's. I mean, if you ever seen him in the interviews, you either love him or you hate him when you watch him in those old 1960s interviews when he was
Kinda
on
have that
tour.
Harrison
It's
Ford,
incredible.
like vibe.
Yeah, kind of. It's the God, what's it
Broody.
called?
Well, he's
Don't Look.
quiet. He's like introverted.
It's
right?
called Don't Look Back. I think it's this great Bob Dylan documentary about a tour that he went on in the 1960s.
Oh, okay.
And there's some interview footage, and I mean, he's an asshole. It's great.
Damn.
I mean, he's absolutely just like sassing back at the reporters. I mean, and you either hate him or you love him.
Yeah, no.
With that, right?
Wow.
But he doesn't say he's a folk musician. But a lot of people would apply that label to him. But I think the interesting thing is that this question of modern popular folk music
Right.
is if you are to be someone who is a fan of modern popular folk music, you would not like the new Bob Dylan album.
Interesting.
Probably.
Okay, so he's
That's my guess.
because my question is because I haven't heard it. And you both have. So
Mhm.
my question is because when I think mainstream folk right now, and this I might be wrong, I think Fleet Foxes, I think Mumford and Sons, I think the Abbott Brothers a little bit. I think
I go Hozier. I go.
A Hozier, yeah.
Florence and the Machine.
Arcade Fire? Not really. I mean, they kind of started out with Funeral. That was a little folk.
I don't listen to Arcade Fire. I have no
Funeral's
opinion
pretty
on
good,
that.
actually.
I don't think I've ever heard an Arcade Fire song.
Oh,
Funeral's
really?
good. But I know what you're talking about. That's actually maybe
They evolved into like synth pop now.
Yeah, they evolved into something different.
Very
But-
cool band.
So when I was asking that question about the Bob Dylan album, I was wondering, did he kind of transfer into this new mainstream folk? But you're saying
Not
he
really,
did.
no.
No, I mean, if anything, he goes to the blues. And that's what I think Bob Dylan would say he is if you were to ask him. He's probably a blues player.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I think he's way better at folk than he is at the blues.
Well, it's like lyrics
But,
versus musicianship, and I think he's more of a lyricist than he was ever a musician.
Yeah, well, he always had a band.
Right.
And
Right.
the lyrics,
He was always a very good guitar player, and he always had. They were called the band.
Right.
It was the name of his band, and they made their own incredible folk rock music without him even.
Right.
But yeah, but I mean, Bob Dylan is sort of where everyone comes back to talk about folk music. But that's really one very specific facet of what the popular consensus of folk music is. Bob Dylan probably, in terms of the direction that folk music went in the mainstream, had more influence as a songwriter than a musician himself.
Yeah.
He had a tremendous influence in terms of the way music went in the underground and in the alternative scene and everything. But you don't have that many incredibly popular singer-songwriters anymore whose vocals are not awesome.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't have a lot of the character singers, the very rough,
Same
nasally.
thing happening on Broadway.
Totally, 100%. Now that's all over alternative music,
Right.
especially alternative folk and folk punk and stuff, which is my jam. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk more about them later, but the Mountain Goats, John Darnielle, has a voice that, while not like Bob Dylan, you could put in that same category of kind of nasally, not technically like the best singer in terms of like singing ability, skill, but an incredible storyteller with their voice. And you see that all over the place.
Like healthiness of the voice.
Totally. That doesn't mean not a good singer, because like they can deliver amazing vocal performances.
Right.
Same with like April Hartman of Apes of the State, and a lot of artists that transition out of punk and folk punk into other genres, like Laura Jane Grace of Against Me and everything, which their first album was very much a folk punk album, and then they're very much a punk band now.
Yeah. So off of this, because we started talking about Mountain Goats, and you mentioned Daniel Johnston in the folk place, and it made me. And at first I was like, no, but then I was like, okay, but why did you say that, and why am I still thinking about it? And so I had this other
reason
question.
I said it was in the documentary, The Devil and Daniel Johnston, that we watched. At one point, they compared him to Bob Dylan. They were like,
they did.
He's an emerging Bob Dylan, a new emerging Bob Dylan. And I was watching that, and like that's kind of why I said that to you. I'm a hypocrite. I haven't like listened to a lot of Daniel Johnston.
But I've listened to a
Dylan,
lot, and I still was thinking about. So this other question I had was, if we scale the genre of folk, right, from this kind of Fleet Foxes, like Winter Hymnal, Helplessness and Blues, maybe some Mumford and Sons in there, stuff that's very ethereal, kind of clean porcelain folk-like music, all the way to, let's talk about, we're heading a little bit towards Mountain Goats, but I'm sure you can name bands that go even more into that raw, messy, just kind of lyrical noise that's like meant to just stir emotion, like pure raw emotion. And that's where Daniel Johnston comes into me. Is like, if there was a scale, Daniel Johnston might be on the complete opposite end, as like Bob Dylan might sit in the middle, of like where that divide is. So I don't know if the scale works, but could we maybe talk about artists and where we put them in like what subgenre their folk is to this scale?
Well, I want to talk about the scale before I talk about artists, because folk is such a weird genre. I love folk music. I don't love all folk music, but I love folk music, and it's a genre that comes at it from a lot of very different directions, right? It comes at sound and lyrics in many different ways, and there's almost no consistency from artist to artist as a whole. Right? Because you can take I would 100% put like Daniel Johnston in folk, right?
Okay,
completely, for sure, right? I would also 100% put Mumford and Sons and Fleet Foxes in folk, right?
Yeah.
What do these artists have in common?
Nothing.
What is the connect? Yeah, right. There's no connecting thread there.
But yet there is, and that's kind of what the question is.
Because maybe your mind goes to, at least they're acoustic. But
Right,
I don't.
there's
but
acoustic
electric folk. I say acoustic bands that aren't folk and electric bands that are folk.
Right.
Now,
Exactly.
now does it have to have that country twang sound to it? I guess like it's not country music, but it's.
I don't.
Is it twangy?
I don't think so.
Really?
Folk can come from country.
I don't. Yeah.
But other kinds of folk don't. Or like, what if we talk about like Irish folk music?
True.
Folk is a genre that I think, as opposed to being united as a whole, because you can talk about subgenres that have similar sounds, similar origins,
Right.
similar feels, similar lyrical content, right? We can start talking about that when we get to like these individual subgenres. Folk as a whole, I think, is more about the origin of the music, and then as we move into pop folk, it's about imitating the aesthetics of the original music,
Right.
right?
Right. Yes.
I would not necessarily. I don't know Mumford and Sons' origin story, right?
Yeah, right.
But I don't think that they were like traditional folk musicians using the tools at their disposal to tell their stories.
They're a little popular.
I think that they learned storytelling and song methods from people who were that way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I can't wait till someone comments and they're like, "Well, actually, they started in their garage with a rubber band and a cardboard box as a guitar."
Yeah.
You know.
Well, yeah, it's funny. It's actually, and a lot of people ask me. I'm not going to linger entirely on folk punk this whole
Yes,
time,
yes.
but I love it in part because of this thing. I'll mention that I like folk punk, and people who don't know about it will be like, "How does that make sense? How does folk punk happen?" I'm like, well, both of these genres sort of come from people using whatever methods they can to express themselves.
Well, and
Right.
correct me if I'm wrong in saying this too. Folk punk is almost counterintuitive in itself because folk comes from a very southern like origin, and then punk comes from a very like progressive, I would say eastern
It'd
origin.
be like
I don't know what
British, European kind of.
No, I wouldn't
British
necessarily
European?
agree.
Okay.
Really?
I wouldn't agree. And in part, you can look at where these things originate. You'd say New York City was a very big hub of the origin of punk music in the 70s,
That's in
right?
the East Coast.
Well,
Yeah.
No, yeah, totally. But it was also a huge origin for folk music in the 70s.
Mhm.
That's where like Bob Dylan played.
Yeah.
The Gaslight.
Greenwich
The
Village.
Gaslight Club.
Greenwich Village is the birthplace or the stomping grounds of so many incredible folk musicians.
Mhm.
But the folk traditions come from somewhere else. The common thread between these two genres, and then we can get back to the question
Yeah,
of
yeah.
what is folk
Yeah.
music, right? But the common thread that I like between folk and punk is that it is a person or people without a special formalized, what was those words? Without special formalized training, right?
Yes.
Finding a way to express themselves by whatever means they can, right?
And both are.
And so we talk about folk music, but music's not the only thing that can be folk. There's also folk tales, right?
Mhm.
Talk about punk, but music's not the only thing that can be punk. There are punk zines, right?
Right.
There's punk fashion in the same way that there kind of is folk fashion, right? Which is sort of like
99
the
Red
ni- the
Balloons
late-
is not a folk song,
Yeah.
but it is a punk song.
no, not. You could probably make that argument.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd call it a punk song, but potentially.
Potentially.
But yeah, there's definitely differences between the genres, right?
Right.
That's why I think they work together really well. But to get to folk, then, I think what makes folk music specific to folk is it comes from a tradition of songwriting that is very working class,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
right? Which is interesting when you get into the social connotations of who listens to what kind of music, because folk music comes from a very working class perspective, even if today it has a reputation of being mostly listened to by college educated NPR
right,
fans,
right.
right?
Evolved.
But that really comes like post civil rights movement,
Right.
you know.
Well, I feel like
Prior to
folk and
that,
punk are both
American
against
folk
the
music.
man, right?
They
They're both
can be.
rebellious.
They often can be, but more than they are protest music,
Yeah.
folk music, as we understand it in America, right?
Right.
Is comes from a lot of the same origins that rock music does.
Right.
A lot of the same origins that country music does.
Mhm.
And it comes from the way we modernly understand it, protest movements, specifically union movements. Right. A lot of Woody Guthrie songs
Yes.
are old union anthems, right? Set to folk music that was adapted from African American rhythms and melodies.
Yes. Yes.
Right? And then from there, or you can go way earlier than Woody Guthrie, of course, but from this general area, right, of the we shall overcomes and all of that, right? And this land is your land, this land is my land. What you end up getting mostly are people who listen to each other
Right. Right.
and make music based on the person that inspired them. and you still have people sprout up here and there, with their own anthems, but they're living in the context of having Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Phil Oakes, Bob Dylan, right? Phil Oakes a little bit later, coming off of Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, but still in that early protest folk era. And then from there, folk is sort of really well known for two things: for its storytelling and for its politics.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you end up with people who, and it's one of the reasons why the acoustic guitar is such a symbol of folk music, is because it's one of the easiest instruments to get.
Well, I would
Right?
say that it is the easiest instrument. Well, it's funny you bring up it being the easiest instrument to get, because I would say it's one of the hardest instruments to master. But at the bare
Mhm.
essentials for what you need to make a folk song, it's actually
Yeah.
quite easy for anyone to do.
Totally, all you need is 3 chords.
Which-
you don't even need 3 chords. You can use 2 chords. You can do 1
Which
chord.
might
if you're
be-
smart about it.
Which might be what separates it from like rock or alternative genre too, is how complicated the musicianship is, and
but even then, punk is the same way as folk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
3 chords in the truth is a
Right.
punk mentality,
Yeah.
right? But it also emerges completely when you look at folk music.
Right.
But the difference you end up having is that a lot of folk artists end up developing their craft more and more and more. So even though folk comes from a place of anyone can play it, because these songs are designed for people to sing along, people to clap along, easy melodies for people to remember.
Right.
In the origins of it, we've developed so far away from that, right?
Yeah.
That you can have artists that are in this long tradition of musicianship, of using instruments that are traditional folk instruments, right? String instruments and soft percussion and acoustic guitars,
Right.
and you end up with a Mumford and Sons and a Fleetwood Mac and
Right.
Fleetwood Mac. No, Fleet Foxes.
Fleet Fox.
I did not mean to say Fleetwood Mac. And Fleet Foxes.
They're kind of folk.
Or you end up on the other side where you have artists who are still, and I'll tell you, those 2 bands, it's like people who have mastered their instruments
Right.
to a degree at
Right.
least,
To a
right?
degree.
They aren't doing prog or whatever. They aren't doing like classical guitar or jazz
Right.
guitar,
Right.
but they have come to understand how to play their instruments at a truly
They-
professional
More than
level.
even understand the instruments, they understand the sound so well that they're able to create really complicated harmony structures and really complicated sound structures. Like if you think about Fleet Foxes and how much they use harmony in their songs, it's crazy. So like I would almost say that it's less about the actual instrument itself. When it comes to folk music, it's more about the music, like the actual sound coming from your instrument. In many cases,
Sure, when we're talking about mastery, sure.
Right.
But I was going to say is that you go to the other direction, and you have people who don't have any of that. You have people who are still just
Daniel Johnston.
Daniel Johnston. You have Daniel Johnston. You have Early Mountain Goats. You have, I'm talking about Brian McPherson. You have all my folk punk that I love, right?
Right.
You,
So what connects them? What connects Fleet Foxes? Let's take a song from Mumford and Sons so that we can use it. The Cave.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's take the song "The Cave"
And London Calling.
and
that's a punk song.
that's a punk song.
Right. Well,
and
if
a
we're connecting-
Daniel Johnston song that you know. Do you know? Give me Daniel Johnston.
Devil Town.
Devil Town. I
Devil
was
Town.
living in a devil town. That's his voice. I love it.
It's great.
It's so great. Didn't know it was a devil town. So what do those songs? What makes both of those songs sit in the same genre? What connects those songs? Even though I'm not trying to get you to like say that they mean the same, I'm trying to say what little thing from each put them in the genre.
So I would say it's not sonic, or if it is, it is something that is almost vestigial at this point, right? What it is origin, because let's say folk music starts with Bob Dylan. It doesn't. It totally doesn't. Right?
It does not.
But let's say the end all and be all of folk influences Bob Dylan for the sake of argument, right?
Yes. It probably starts more with African culture, blues, and
It starts with traditional African music that then comes overseas in the Atlantic slave trade, and then
it's important for us to
develops into
mention that
African
before
spirituals.
using this metaphor. That's why I bring it up.
No, yeah.
But yes.
I'm saying Bob Dylan as a stand-in for 1960s
Right.
popular
Right.
protest folk
Right.
music, right? By singer-songwriters.
Right. Perfect.
There's a folk music splitting off before that became country western or came to influence blues and stuff without even becoming folk music. But we're gonna say that folk music, for the sake of these two bands, because they definitely come from this tradition.
Right.
Or these two artists come from the 1960s protest folk movement, right?
Yes.
Then I would say that what connects them is that Daniel Johnston, even if not directly, looked at Bob Dylan and did something inspired by that. Even if he wasn't thinking in his head, oh, I'm going to do Bob Dylan, or I'm going to do 1960s protest folk,
Right.
he was like, I'm going to do lo-fi, lyrically driven, simple melody music, right? That expresses inner turmoil and social dissatisfaction.
And in his case,
Right.
is the drug-induced ramblings of a man on LSD, and
Sure, yeah, but that was also the 1960s.
right, which is why I bring it up. I think it actually does play into that.
100%.
So now, how
100%.
does that
No.
compare to the Cave?
Well, let's go back to our let's say faceless 1960s
Yes.
LSD influenced folk artist, right?
Yes.
Well, let's just say Bob Dylan for the sake of it right now.
Right.
Bob Dylan writes Mr. Tambourine Man, right?
Play us a song.
Yeah, and it gets big, but it gets bigger when the Byrds play it, right? And the Byrds know how to play their instruments,
Yes.
So that's why.
right? And Bob Dylan in his time, big artist, bigger songwriter,
Right.
huge songwriter, right? And then you have this movement into pop folk music, right? And you have Peter, Paul, and Mary, and you have the Byrds, like I said, and you have
Fleetwood Mac, kind of.
no,
Not really.
no, they're like arena rock.
Yeah. I would say they would lean more towards, I would say, country than they would folk.
Maybe
Landslide's a little folkish.
You could maybe go like, well, it's all the same thing when it gets like the 70s. There's all this very, unless you are like early like proto metal music and proto punk music, it's gonna be very folk influenced because that was the big sound of the 60s,
Right.
of the late 60s. Or it's funk, right, which
Right.
is its own category of very good music.
Right.
But you have the Byrds and you have Peter, Paul, and Mary, and you have people who are taking the very simple melodies and simple, evocative, effective lyrics of 1960s singer-songwriters, and they're adding harmonies, and they're adding more complicated instrumentation, and they're adding strings, and they're adding all these things, right?
Right.
And then that develops on its own line of folk music that then becomes Mumford & Sons, The Cave.
Right. Okay.
Interesting.
Right? That's what I'm saying. It comes back to the same origin. You can go farther back and say all music is the modern music is the blues. And you'd be right. You know? You can go farther back and say all modern music is African American spirituals.
Right.
You'd be completely
Yeah.
correct. You know? Unless you're talking about like classical music. But modern popular music. But for the sake of this, I'm going to say that folk music, what it has in common is coming from a common source. And this is why we can talk about Irish folk music and British folk music and stuff in the same kind of general category, is because what's the word for it? It's not convergent evolution. It might be convergent evolution. There's this concept in science where you'll find in places that are completely geographically distant very similar animals because the same kind of adaptations led to them evolving. Right? Because they were both suited in similar ways for their environments.
Yeah, like a
natural selection, kind of.
like another Earth in another dimension that happens to have the same timelines.
Kind of, yeah. And you see this in the real world where you see like birds across the world that both have the same shape beak because they're hunting similar prey and it evolved separately.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But they evolved in the same way. And the similar things happen with folk music, right?
Yeah.
You look at Britain and Ireland, and they have their own classic music traditions coming up from ancient times, and then they have the easy accessibility of the guitar and other acoustic instruments, right? And classic folk instruments, the importance of simple melodies and repeatable words, as well as with American folk music, both American folk music and European folk music, also share a lot of musical influences from popular classical music.
Right.
You have to go way far back to find all that, and we've evolved really far from that.
Right.
But that's why you see some of these similarities across the world. Now, talking about folk music, like African folk music is also folk music, but it will sound very different, right?
Yeah.
Same with East Asian folk music, right?
Right.
You go all around the world, and folk music will sound different, but we call it folk music because ultimately it comes from folk, right? It comes from the people. It comes from an expression of the working class in their turmoil and their view on the world.
Yeah.
And that's why it's really weird sometimes to listen to modern pop folk music because it's so far from that. It can be really good.
No, yeah.
But it's basically just pop music with acoustic instruments.
Well, it's
to an extent.
It's kind of them taking everything folk listeners love about folk, centering it in on those like very, very just basic things, and bringing them to a genre that already exists to amplify what's already there. You know, like you're not actually starting from the root. You're just pulling what people like about that genre into another genre to attempt to create something new. In reality, you're just taking inspiration from things that already exist.
Sure. Well, and be clear, all music is taking inspiration from other music. Nothing
That's
is original.
very true.
And I don't want to blame anyone for taking inspiration from other things. I'm just saying that there is a very interesting and clear difference between Mumford & Sons and Daniel Johnston, in that Mumford & Sons music is trying to be popular.
Yeah.
And Daniel Johnston.
And I think that's
he didn't care about the popularity or commercial success.
It's actually, I'm gonna kind of combat you guys on that a little bit actually, because Daniel Johnston in the documentary, when he moved to New York, was like, I'm gonna be the biggest thing ever. He had this complex.
He did have the ego.
He had the ego. He came in with an an album of like 20 songs, that all at once gave to a producer. And he was like, okay, I actually kind of like this. And then what really made him famous was Kurt Cobain wore a shirt with his album cover on it, and everyone started listening to Daniel Johnston during his big tour.
Totally, and I'm gonna lay down. Maybe it's semantic, but Mumford & Sons wanted to be popular, and Daniel Johnston wanted to be heard.
You know what? That actually, yeah.
And I think that's the big
He didn't
difference
want to
when you're
conform
really looking at it between pop music that is actively aiming to be pop music, and music that is being music, even if it has very auditory similarities to the pop music. You can find like bedroom pop music, right, and fuzz pop music. Sometimes you're like, why is this very small indie band a pop band? But it's because use of the sound. But the difference is they're wanting to be, or not even wanting, but being popular versus being heard, right? Or what your goal is. And you can have both things, and you can be extremely popular and still want to be heard. I don't want to act like pop music or commercial music cannot have art. It absolutely can.
Okay, so from this, I have another question. And it kind of goes back to what you're talking about, how now the people who listen to folk punk are there's NPR.
Well, listen to folk music.
Listen to folk
NPR doesn't play folk.
I meant to say
music.
folk.
I wish I could tune up on NPR and fucking Pat the Bunny was playing. It was like, I hate myself.
No, I guess I meant to say folk music. So you talk about like those people who on NPR listen to folk music, and how now kind of the upper class listens to folk music as kind of like why would you say that is?
Well, it's just a stereotype that college educated people like folk music and working class people like country music.
Right. Okay, and so here is where my question ties into that.
I don't know if it's true, but
is that, you know, where do we listen to folk music as a society? Like, besides you, who will listen to folk music in your car on the way to the store, you know, you talk about folk music being this kind of against the man, you know, like at a rally. You know, what relation does history of folk have on this thought? The literal locations where folk thrives best or has thrived the most?
Yeah. I think it really depends on what kind of folk we're talking about. Pop folk music, modern popular, not popular folk music, but pop music that's also folk music. That is designed to kind of thrive anywhere, right?
Yeah.
I can play. I don't know, and I promise I'm not trying to hate on folk pop music.
No, that's
I think
good.
it's
Like
very
if
good.
you can play
Yeah.
anywhere, that
but-
is an admirable
well,
thing.
Well, I was gonna say my mind goes to like the grocery store where it's playing on the speakers overhead, but I don't want that to sound like an insult. I just mean that.
Elevators.
I mean, you can. Well, no, because when you're looking for music to play in a public space that will be accessed by a lot of kinds of people, what you don't want is someone to look up and say, "What the fuck is this?"
Yeah. Yeah, you don't want
Right.
someone. You don't want to be in a grocery store and then all of a sudden, a crazy Daniel Johnston song comes on, Casper the Friendly Ghost, and they're like,
They're
Casper the Friendly
confused by the
Ghost.
minds they lead.
Yeah, and
just
it's,
go off those
everyone's like,
blocks.
what are we listening to?
Yeah.
No,
everyone's
yeah.
distracted.
Folk pop music is designed to be listened to anywhere and everywhere. It's designed to have songs that you lie in your bed and cry to at night.
Yeah.
Songs that you dance down the street to with all your friends.
Which I've cried to Daniel
and-
Johnson songs, but
Oh no, 100%. But folk music has songs that you shout an anthem at the concert.
There's
Right,
danceability, there's energy.
all kinds of songs, but most with songs that are designed for a lot of people at once to listen to and love,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Or for everyone to be fine with somewhere.
Right.
And then you get into like protest folk, which very clearly the origin of that is protest, is mass protest,
Right.
and that is a group of like-minded people coming together.
usually in
to
a minority,
express-
right?
Usually, well, often for civil rights, but I actually don't know if I would like
That's probably very
apply
historical.
that as like a well, yeah, but even a lot of the songs that were sung in for the civil rights movement come from like workers' union movements, right? I think that if we're talking about the origin of like American like folk protest music, it is broader than specifically civil rights. It is the rights of the average citizen,
Right.
It is working class rights, the rights of the underprivileged in general, and in terms of location and physicality, that has the most power and influence, but also like the right place at a big event,
Right.
right? I have to imagine listening to the musicians actually during the civil rights movement at these events was probably way more incredible than when you pull it up on Spotify.
Right. Exactly.
Even though they could still be good, but there's a place for those to be meant to listen to, and it's with these crowds, with people who know the words or can quickly learn the words, singing along, right?
I think the thing about folk
yeah.
music, it's like a very live genre of music. You hear it a lot at coffee shops, a lot of like restaurants, public places. Because I think, like pop music, it's not a live genre of music. There's certain
Right.
genres that it's like you don't connect with the people around you as you listen to that music because it's a little more produced.
The last thing that folk, I would say, in the majority, there's definitely subsections of folk that are this, but the last thing I would call the majority of folk is overproduced.
Yeah.
It's minimalist kind of.
Yeah.
I think
Little.
usually, well, part of that is it being acoustic usually.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And part of that, because I wanted to send another very like common stereotypical location for folk music is around a campfire.
Right.
Because you're sharing stories, you're sharing tales, and a lot of folk music is very storytelling driven, or it's very communal, and it comes from these traditions of oral storytelling, right?
Okay, so I have another question about this, unless you have another thought.
No, I mean I was just gonna go to like the other place you will find folk music, like classically, if you want to go to like the more folk punk side, it is like a loud, angry concert.
Yes.
But again, it's a celebration of community,
Right.
More than anything.
Well, and I
else.
even think in a certain place, probably Nashville, but in certain cities that aren't, I would say, well, you know what? I don't necessarily know, but I would say there would be a mosh pit somewhere with folk punk going on.
Oh, definitely. Folk punk is designed to be mosh too. A lot of it is.
Right. Same way grunge
But that's the
is, I would say.
Well, sure. That's the folk punk. That's more on the punk side of folk punk. There's also folk punk. Like, it's funny. you'll have an artist who is singing and the voice is kind of rough and they have an acoustic guitar and there's no one else and their label is folk punk, and it's like, what separates that from like just folk? And a lot of the times it's tempo.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so actually,
a lot of the, if you, I'm gonna have a guitar here, but if you go like,
that's folk.
that's folk. But
Yeah.
if you, that's folk. But if you go,
that's folk punk.
that becomes folk punk. It's just a
Exactly.
question of sometimes it's just a question of tempo.
Right. Okay. So, and this is perfect transition into so you play folk punk and you write folk punk, and we actually should have mentioned this earlier. We listened to one of your songs at the beginning of this, and there's going to be another one of your songs tagged on the end of this. Not full versions, but you can see those full versions hopefully soon because you're going to be posting those on YouTube.
Yeah, I'm gonna post a little EP up on YouTube at Headstone Hills is my artist name.
Good.
Stone Hills.
And so my question is, this is weird, but I'm like a theater student, so hear me out. When you're playing folk, and I think this plays into this last question of where we're playing folk. Now I want to talk about the action itself, get a little bit existential with you, and talk about where you actually feel folk in your body when you're writing the songs and when you're playing the songs. Is there a difference between when you're writing it and when you're playing it, and where does it sit? Because for me, there's music that's very heady. There's music that's very in your feet. There's music that's very in your bass. But when I think of folk, I really struggle because I always just think the heart, but it seems too bland. Where do you think folk actually sits?
So I would say first of all, when you're writing folk, at least for me, the words come from the head. Like I think most words do. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they come from the gut, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like the better songs come from the head. And then the music, as you're figuring out the music, that comes from the gut. That comes from what sounds right here.
Yeah.
As opposed to other genres where figuring out the music, like if you're talking about like math rock, right? That's the extreme example.
Right.
That's gonna be in the head when you're writing the music. Performing the music, I'd say the sternum. Right in the back middle of the chest.
Right, it's where it's hard.
Not what?
Where it's hard.
Oh yeah, where it's hard.
Like I feel that.
It's stiff there. It hurts.
Exactly.
It hurts if you get hit there, but it's also protective. It's protecting all the squishy, soft things inside.
But it makes me think about
right?
folk vocal styles too, and how because I take a lot of voice lessons. I've taken voice lessons for a long time, and we talk about where we sing from: soft palate, our head voice, our chest voice, even our stomach voice. And a lot of times for musical theater artists, when you're switching from your chest to your head voice, it's all about singing first from the lower pelvic bowl of your body, and then switching to up over the back of your skull. Where in folk, and especially in folk punk, I feel it starts down in that pelvic bowl, and it actually pushes through the chest and at the front of your face. Like comes out the front of your throat when you're singing.
It's like it gets stuck behind that hard bone in the middle of your chest and like bubbles up there and
that bone represents the man.
Breaks out.
I mean, I'm being serious. Like it does.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It does.
Folk punks, break your chest.
Yes. Sing through your sternum. That's not as good. But yes, essentially the same thing.
Wait, you said that the best comes from the mind, not the gut. I feel like folk is so like improvisational and instinctual that like your gut feeling is what would write a good folk song.
See, I wouldn't say folk is. I wouldn't say folk is improvisational at all.
Oh,
folk
really?
See, that's more the blues
especially
side.
modern folk. I would say that's blues. That's jazz. Folk is extremely lyric intensive, and that's actually one of the things that I want to talk about when we talk about folk music. One of the places where, in general, if we're talking about non-instrumental folk music, because you also have folk music that is purely instrumental, that is based on traditional music stylings, right? Often strings without like the country swing to it, right?
Yeah.
But if we're talking about folk music, then the words are incredibly important because they come from a tradition of oral storytelling, right? They come from a place of chants at rallies, and they come from a place, for a lot of people, of intense, expressive remark, right? Folk is absolutely a songwriter's genre, in that you will have a songwriter write a song and then a bunch of people cover it, but it kind of is remembered still as the songwriter's song.
Right.
Compare that to the blues and rock, where it becomes known as the song of whoever did it best
Right.
or in the most popular fashion. Like consider that Elvis Presley wrote none of his songs.
Right.
It's all about the
But
glamour.
Hound Dog is an Elvis Presley song.
Yeah,
despite it being
exactly.
written by a black woman like 20 years prior.
Right,
Wow.
exactly. Okay, so and
Right, or
I
15
don't
years
mean
prior.
this to sound insensitive at all, and I actually hope this to sound as a compliment to the speech itself. But like the "I Have a Dream" speech from Martin Luther King, I could see though how much that meant in more of a folk song. You could not put those words into a pop song.
Yeah, or it would be really different.
Or it'd be really different.
You really can. All these genres do things in their different ways. Pop music relies way more on I would say rock music more than any of them is feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is the sound of the music and how the words work with the music.
Right.
And pop music then is
Material. sort of?
No, it's kind of about being smart. Honestly, people call pop dumb, and pop's dumb, but pop is kind of about the
Pop
interplay
is
of words
the
with music.
entrepreneur. It's the young entrepreneur of the.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. No, yeah, pop interplays words into music, right?
Right.
Rock music you will listen to and love and not know any of the words except for the chorus, right? Who knows the verses to like their favorite rock songs?
Right.
Unless they're like very like lyric heavy. Some rock bands are. Pop music, we love pop lyrics. Pop lyrics are incredible and catchy and excellent. Tied with poppy, catchy music.
Right.
Folk, the music's important and it can establish a mood, but we're there for the lyrics.
Yeah.
I would say we're usually there for the lyrics can be there to establish a mood and feeling as well, but that's why we're there.
Right.
And-
Okay, so on this topic, sorry, Luke, did you
Oh,
have something
yeah.
to say?
I guess if we're let's bring in hip hop, right?
Right.
I feel like hip hop could be very similar to folk. Like you could compare them.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Actually.
Oh, totally.
similar.
Actually, in a really interesting way, you're absolutely right. It's one of those things where white musicians keep stealing black songwriting techniques,
Yeah.
black styles of music.
Exactly.
That's what I mean. That's what folk is. Folk comes from African American traditional music in a lot of ways, mixed with some European traditional
Right.
music. And then as well as like blues stolen from black people, right? Jazz stolen from black people, rock
Right.
stolen from black people. But the origin for all these here is music that rises up from a population that is hurting and that feels the need to be expressed,
Yeah.
which is almost all, which in all of these cases has been black Americans, and
Just about to
that's
say that.
why that's why lyric content is often so important.
Right.
Now there are versions where lyric content ceases to be as important in expressing these feelings. Jazz is one of these, right?
Right. But in
but looking at
in
hip hop
jazz,
is
the music,
Chords
the
and
notes
the- yeah,
are
it
the
all-
lyrics. Like
it
the
all does
notes are the lyrics. In a weird
100%.
way, it's like
You know, I'm not a folk expert, but I'm even less a hip hop expert, so I don't want to belabor on that and like start explaining why hip hop's important.
Yeah.
I just want to say that hip hop comes from
Same mindset,
people,
the mentality, kind of.
well, no, I was saying in its origins, often hip hop and new genres of hip hop will come from populations that do not feel seen, do not feel heard, and are looking for a way to express themselves, and that's why lyrics are so important. I cannot remember what article it was. I think I want to say it was like Slant or something. But there's a really great line about John Darnielle, the Mountain Goats, that calls him the best non-hip hop lyricist. And I always think that's a very specific and very important caveat.
very important. Yes.
Because there's some really amazing things happening in hip hop
Okay.
music in terms of lyrics.
So on this note, could you just throw off the top of your head? I'm putting you on the spot here. 3 folk lyrics that mean a lot to you, and just give brief description on why they do, and maybe some of them can be your own. Maybe one of them can be your own too.
It's not going to be my own.
Okay, well then here's what I'll say. here's what I'll say. Please give me 3 that aren't your own, and then give me one that is your own, because I do want you to go into depth about. How about this? After this, please go in depth about one of your songs and go into the writing process behind writing something in the form.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we can talk about that. I'll go through 3. Is it okay if I look up the actual lyrics so I can say them correctly?
I will allow it.
That's good.
All right, awesome.
Our folk
All right,
expert.
I have a bad memory.
No, it's okay.
All right, yeah. So, 3 songs. This first song I'm going to talk about is called "Oh Susquehanna" by Defiance, Ohio. Really great folk punk band. I think coming out of Pennsylvania. I want to say, well, maybe Ohio. That would make more sense. But I think they might be in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of folk punk in Pennsylvania, and I get them confused sometimes. But the lyric from "Oh Susquehanna" is and I feel like this could all come to no good. The kids who populate these cul-de-sacs will never know what stood beneath their cookie-cutter houses, fields and streams and woods. They'll sit in cars and wait for mom to drive them out of this boring neighborhood.
I love that.
Wow.
And it's great. Every time I put on that song, every time I get there, I'm like, this is so good. I mean, it's about the encroaching of suburbia on nature and about the increasing compartmentalization and cleaning up of neighborhoods and of areas that people live in. The whole song is about someone going back to the place that they grew up and seeing what it looks like now.
It's like gentrification.
Seeing how it's become this this somewhat gentrified suburb, where the fields and the streams and the woods have been paved over by these cookie cutter houses. It's a great lyric.
That's a great lyric.
Yeah. Next one is an Apes of the State, another wonderful folk punk band that I love. From their song "I Listened." There's a lot of great lines in this song, but one of the ones I like a lot is like how you said with tears in your eyes that you wish that being grateful was enough to keep you from feeling sad all the time.
Oh, it's just like it's.
You're gonna get the sad ones with me.
I was gonna say.
That's just what I like.
Well, it's just.
But like, isn't that a mood though that you're like, why don't I feel happy? I should feel happy. I'm grateful for so many things. I have so many wonderful things. Why am I not happy?
Well, and
right?
I understand
and
your
that line expresses that
from
so well.
Gut to brain when it comes to these lyrics, like, and why you said that, and it's very guttural, and it's very heady. It's like
the actual construction of the lyrics is so smart and precise, and it's like how in theater the playwright is God, right?
Right.
And the words are so important versus how in movies the screenwriter is whatever and they'll change whatever they want on set. And I just compare that more to like rock music sometimes.
Right.
Can I take 2 more?
Go ahead. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Oh, yeah, because the last one I'm going to do is a chorus, and I was trying to avoid choruses because I wanted to stick to like a more specific verse.
Oh, yeah,
I'll do a chorus left. The third one is the Mountain Goat song.
Okay.
Riches and Wonders off their album All Hill West Texas, an incredible album. I believe the only album to ever hit on the Billboard charts that was recorded on a boombox with the inbuilt microphone.
Awesome.
I love this album, but the lyric is I am healthy, I am whole, and I have poor impulse control, and I want to go home, but I am home. And it's funny. It's a little funny. It's a little sad, and it's very relatable.
It's everything, man. I mean, and Dan,
the Mountain Goats is the best. I could have picked 30 Mountain Goats lyrics.
Now, like that just made me think of Daniel Johnston too, and like how he, without knowing it, is pulling from, like you said, people like Mountain Goats and well, who came after or during?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Oh, I mean, when was Daniel Johnston? Mountain 90s. Goats itself. So was Mountain Goats. The Mountain Goats just released a new album, but the very first Mountain Goats EP was called Songs for Petronius, and it came out in 1992.
Probably a little bit before Daniel Johnston.
Yeah, but it was that was California though, so that might not even have been in the same.
But it's like you said with the fucking birds, man, and the beaks.
Yeah, exactly. The 90s was a huge period for this, of this like. Divergent, converging, whatever the actual word is, evolution that came up in parallel lines, because so many people in the 90s were so mad all the time, apparently. And you see this, I mean, you can
an alternative music,
right? Or grunge.
grunge. Yeah.
Well, yeah, all of it. The 90s and also the 90s.
Listen to
was an era
Everclear
where
and you'll
suddenly-
understand how pissed off they were. And Sublime.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, 90s was also an era where suddenly you could distribute your own music way more accessibly than ever before. And now we're like that times infinity. But the 90s was the internet was starting to exist, right? You had like affordable tape decks and cassettes that you could record yourself if you wanted to. And exactly. And you started to have people sharing around, passing around music like this that you used to be able to do as well, but now you can do it on a much more minute level.
Right.
But anyway, my very last lyric. So those three are all from more folky songs, right? Or more more heady, not technical in terms of instrumentation, in terms of the lyrics and how that was working, storytelling songs. Right. But the last is from a much more punky folk punk song. One of my favorite songs, by one of my favorite bands. It's "Your Heart Is a Muscle the Size of Your Fist" by Ramshackle Glory, and that kind of gives away the lyric, because the lyric is, "Your heart is a muscle the size of your fist. Keep on loving, keep on fighting, and hold on, hold on, hold on for your life."
And that is right where you're talking about the sternum. And your heart is a muscle the size of your fist, and it's trying so hard to express itself behind the man, behind.
Absolutely. No, Ramshackle Glory, you can hear whenever whenever you listen to the recording, especially the live version that they have, and it's just such an anthem. You can hear the band dancing. It's incredible.
Right.
And it's so funny. I could co-host an entire separate podcast about Pat the Bunny, the singer-songwriter behind Ramshackle Glory. But what I'll say really quick, what's interesting about him, because he is one of the biggest influences on modern folk punk music. Right. Primarily active from 2006 just to 2012. But that song was originally released when he was doing some solo music before Ramshackle Glory formed. And it's so interesting listening to one person on an acoustic guitar sing that lyric, right? And it feels like a lone voice shouting out from the middle of the ocean. And then they have a whole band playing it together live. And it's this incredible solidarity and this feeling and this community that is... Well, honestly, the thing that's what I love about folk punk is the there's a very angry, tragic side that's all about drowning yourself in liquor and cigarettes and drugs and stuff. But there's another side that's about community involvement, and it's about making the world a better place, one person at a time. And that's the part I love.
And to bring it back to Daniel Johnston, a lot of his songs sound like that cry you're talking about. And whereas in this one you get that, in this song you talk about the hardest muscle size your fist, you get that surrender, you get that release at the end. In the Daniel Johnston songs, it seems like he starts off alone and he ends up somehow more alone at the end of the song. And that's definitely accurate. And even when people were listening, it was still that way. And and I think that's, if we're going to talk about that range, you talked about how the popular, they're just trying to be popular, trying to be everywhere. That's the range. It's how much you're heard and how much that release is. And so on one end, you have heard by everyone all the time, maybe not as intently and but just always heard. And on the other end, you have
people who don't want to be discovered, and
no, there is no surrender, but everyone's listening so intently.
Everyone is listening on their own.
Yes.
Everyone is listening, and everyone is alone. Even if you're in a crowded room listening, you're still alone.
Exactly, and that's the difference between Mumford and Sons and Daniel Johnston. Is how alone you are. And it's
sure, but even then, bands towards Daniel Johnston can make you feel in a community. Even Daniel Johnston can.
And I think what they do is they tease being alone first and then go into community. Whereas Mumford and Sons starts in community.
You're alone together.
You're alone together, exactly.
If you are all alone in the exact same way, and that's really reassuring.
Yeah, it is like sometimes it's hard to be friends with that person whose life is going perfect, because it just makes you think a little bit about how yours isn't. And so that's folk music. It's the music that lets you feel kind of okay with the shit going on in your life, because you feel related, like there's a relation. And that's also what you said, it came out of these groups that suffered horrible in many cases prejudices against them. That's where the music came from, is they a want to be felt with. It's a weird sentence, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
You know what
and
I
then
mean.
and that kind of thing can emerge, in a community that's not being listened to and that's being pushed down on, and in one kid in their bedroom who feels like the world's against them.
I mean, every single listener perceives just the entire song completely differently. Like I don't think anyone's mind thinks exactly like when listening to any folk song. Or any song in general, we just have different takes.
Probably so. I mean, there's a great example right there in the Mountain Goats lyric I listed. The line, "I want to go home, but I am home." It's intended as a very very sad line.
Mm-hmm.
It's intended as the song. The song is about a couple. It's intended as, I feel like I want to go home, but the issue is that I'm home, right? You should be home, but you don't feel like home. But I love the song for a different reason. Because the other way you take that lyric, and the way that me and my boyfriend often take it when we listen to the song together, is that the world, it makes you anxious and afraid and terrified, and it makes you always feel like you want to go home. But the nice thing is that you are home, is that your home is with you all the time, right? There's two different ways, and the first way is the way that John Darnielle, the singer-songwriter behind the Mountain Goats, intended it. But he's heard people talk about the other interpretation, and he thinks it's really interesting.
Well, and it's
I think a lot of the best songwriters are really embracing of alternate interpretations of their music in that way.
Well, and that's the other thing about lyrics in folk music. They're so broad, in that broad or metaphorical, in a sense.
Well, I would say sometimes they're hyper specific.
Yeah, well, I guess that's kind of what I meant by metaphorical, in a weird way. In a weird way, because in a weird way, they're so hyper specific, and they're broadly specific. It's hard to explain. It's like
they're like concrete words, not abstract words.
Here's what they do. Here's what the best ones do. Is they find what is universal in specific moments, right? Because if you try to go broad, you will be tacky.
Yeah.
You will not. People will not think you're sincere because you're not being sincere.
Right.
If you say, "I'm so sad, nobody loves me," then no one will believe you.
Yeah.
But if you talk about sitting in your bedroom and looking at a photo album with a coffee stain on the corner, right, and turning the pages, and and everyone in half the people in the photographs are dead.
Right.
That's a very specific experience that I might not have, you might not have, but that sadness feels honest.
Right. Okay.
And I think that's what folk music is so good at. Is it takes these hyper specific moments.
Right.
Some of the best lyricists in general. That I think a lot of the best lyricists exist in folk music. Take these hyper specific moments and then slowly draw out what makes them so universal.
Well, would you mind going into one of your songs and and just kind of to your comfort level, obviously, and to what you want to leave as a mystery or leave as interpretation as well. To others, sometimes telling everyone what to think is not the right choice as an artist or your choice you want to make. But would you mind at least going into the methods and the means in which you go to write a folk song, or one in particular, and where it comes from inside?
Yeah. Do you know some of my songs? Do you have any requests?
Well, there's this song. I'm thinking specifically of the one you just sent me. It's "Meet Me Back Here."
Yeah, we can talk about Meet Me Back Here.
Yeah.
So this is absolutely a story song. It was intended as such, and that's my favorite kind of song to write nowadays. I used to write a lot more songs that were very, very, this is how I feel right now, and there's definitely artistic validity in that, and there's a lot of truth in that. But I really like songs about other people in other situations. So I started thinking about a situation, thinking about a scenario, and connecting things back to my own life in ways that maybe this isn't something that specifically happened to me, but it's similar to something that happened to me, right? And so I came up with this idea for Meet Me Back Here of someone whose childhood best friend sort of stopped showing up when they were a kid. And they were told for a long time that this kid moved away, right?
Yeah.
But really this kid ran away and was never seen again. And so I started thinking about that and thinking about how this would feel as a person receiving this reaction, this news, right? And you start to get into the head, and you start vague, right? You want the listener to start questioning and thinking about what you're talking about when you start, right? So for this song, for example, the first 3 lines are "No, please don't, say it again, turn it around," right? And that's a very guttural reaction to learning the truth of what happened to your childhood best friend.
No,
and then there's this sense, and then you start thinking about what are images, what are moments, what are things that can connect very specifically to someone's sense memory, right? And so I was thinking in that. So I talk about rain. I talk about more than that though, about a secret place that they would meet. Right. Because that's something that a lot of us had when we were kids, right? Whether it was according to whatever vague specifics, kind of an oxymoron, but that are in the song, right? Whatever sort of
that's what I meant earlier when they said broad specifics, vague specifics.
Yeah, whatever sort of like transient details,
exactly.
are in the song. But we all had somewhere like that. We all had somewhere that we would go with our best friend and talk for hours. And I wanted to meet that there, and then you just start adding the details. Now, there are lots of different folk writers and lots of different songwriters who all have their different techniques, and some will go way more specific, some will go really broad and nail it, right? Maybe it's just me who can't do it, But the Mountain Goats are really well known for how specific they are in detail, and that's one of the things I was really thinking of. My mom calls this song the Green and White Van song, because one of the lines is, but then you left town in the green and white van. We never went back to that place again. And that's what the main character thought when the narrator thought when their friend disappeared. But then the very next line is, but nobody told me you ran away. And I it's hitting those juxtapositions and those revelations of the truth and those moments. And so that was the lyric writing part of it, right? And then it's funny because I'm not a very good guitar player.
You are a great guitar player, but you're just good enough to be a folk player.
No. I'm what I am is coming from. This is how I just justify it to myself. The tradition of I will use whatever tools are at my disposal to tell stories, right? And this one was actually, when I wrote it, it's harder to play now than when I wrote it, because when I wrote it, I played it with a capo and I don't anymore. I only play it with a capo because of the F sharp minor, because I could not bar chords when I first started learning how to play guitar. I finally learned how to play an F sharp minor, and so it's a little bit harder now because I don't bar it anymore, and it's now in the key of A instead of the key of G. But because the lyrics are so important, the music needs to be very straightforward and conclusive, right? It needs to have a nice repetition to it without getting too repetitive. I fiddle around mostly in the song with 1, 4, and 5 in the key of A, right? It's the verses go A, D, A, E, and then A, D, F sharp minor A, right? The minor 6, which is also a very common chord in songwriting. I don't go too far out of there because I don't want to distract from the actual words. You don't want to distract from the story. You want the music to help elevate the story and make it carry through and work, and make people feel the story as opposed to just hearing the story. Does that answer your question?
That does.
Any other
that's
thoughts?
Great. That's so great, and it's good because the main thing for me is that I've played this song with you. I have listened to the song multiple times. I love this song. I'll play it at the end here for the
I'll get to listen to it. Yeah.
so that you guys
I
can
don't think I've
listen
ever
to it.
listened to it. Yeah.
But I would. This is my first time hearing the story behind it, and I had created my own narrative.
Interesting.
You know, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's mine, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
and I think that is, and what you talk about, this idea of detail that is. What do you say? You said transient detail. Is very fluid throughout all of folk music, and especially in folk punk, and especially in what you're writing as well. And that, like you said, with these specifics, it's not you're not trying to get someone to remember that time they saw a green and white van. You're trying to pull an emotion, pull on a string of emotion that someone else has felt. And I think through the song, it's done very, very well. And it did that for me, and that's why I was able to relate it to my life, even though I have no relation to the actual story. And that's
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, as a songwriter, I am extremely happy you have your own story from it. Honestly, because I don't think it matters if the listener gets the same story that I put into it.
Right.
I think what matters is if the story I put into it, if it feels true.
Well, and I've always said that I love this song, and that's one of my favorite ones you've ever written. Yet I didn't know what it was about. That's
but you formed your own meaning.
Right, exactly.
Right. You could tell. I hope at least that it was about something.
Right.
And you could form your own plot. And sometimes I always love learning what the artist had to say about a song, because sometimes that helps me appreciate it more.
Right.
For example, there's a Mountain Goats album about wrestling. That's very good, I think. But when I first, I was like, I don't want to listen to this. It's about wrestling. I'm not really into wrestling. And then I discovered that it's about that because John Darnielle, as a kid, that's the only time he ever connected with his stepfather at all was when they would go see amateur wrestling, and it's kind of about that. And I was like, okay, there's a really interesting personal angle right here. And then on a more specific angle, there's a song on that album called Fire Editorial that I've never liked very much. I love almost every song on that album, but that Fire Editorial always was very like this. I can't bop to this. It's weirdly jazzy.
Yeah.
And then I listened to an interview where John Darnielle talks about everyone calls that song jazzy, but it took me like 4 weeks to learn that riff. And I'm like, you know what? Fair enough.
Yeah.
And so learning those little things make you value it more. But anyway, what I'm ultimately coming to is that the last song on that album is about a hair match, which is when a wrestler loses a match and they are sat down in the chair in the center of the ring and they are shaved, right? And it's a moment of humiliation, right?
Yeah.
And it's basically about this person selling themselves out, right?
Yeah.
Getting paid to do this, knowing that they'll never really get back the reputation of the wrestling character that they lose from this, right? It's a wonderful melancholy without being too sad of a song, but the biggest question of it all, and what I love about it is the question of who is singing it, because it's very clearly a person, it's very clearly a character,
Right.
but it's unclear who it is, and there's space there for everyone to kind of read into it their own way.
For everyone to take that song into their life and use it. And that's what music, this folk music that we've been talking about, is for you to use it. It's a tool to express and a tool to. It's a tool. Music is a tool.
Yeah. And it's okay if you know exactly what's going on. Awesome. If you have no idea what's going on, that can be fun. but if you think you know what's going on, I think that's actually where the magic is.
Yeah.
When everyone thinks the story's about them.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Okay, so I have one more thing. We're getting towards the end here.
Hit me.
I just have one more thing I just want you to leave off our listeners with is just 3 bands that you feel, whether or not folk is their genre, people should listen to merely for the lyrics and the meaning behind them and the impact those lyrics have on the world and people who listen to them.
Bands or artists, like more broadly.
Okay, so either.
Yeah. I'm not even gonna say the Mountain Goats because I've already talked enough about them. And
Yes.
you should know if you want to listen to them by now. So I'm gonna skip
Go
them.
ahead.
I will say, let's start classical. I'm gonna go with Phil Oakes.
Phil Oakes.
Phil Oakes is actually my favorite of like the 1960s protest folk
okay.
era. Specifically, his songs "I Love Me," "I'm a Liberal," and the Draft Dodgers rag are very good. He's very satirical. He has a very nice wit. His songs are funny and political and really great. I highly recommend Phil Oakes. Yeah, I'm coming a little bit more modern, just in terms of bands that people or artists people might not have heard. I'm gonna say I'm gonna stick a little bit to folk. I'm gonna try and go with people who I haven't talked about really so far. I'm gonna say Mischief Brew.
Mischief Brew.
Mischief Brew, who the lead singer very tragically passed away a year or so ago.
Oh.
But their music is still up there, and it's really great. They're folk punk, but coming more from a folk angle. And they're very traditional folk songs. And the song "Old Time Memory" is one of my favorites. I don't know. There's something very soothing about Mischief Brew's songs that make you feel very much like you are sitting around a campfire with your rowdiest friends and trading songs. And then I'm gonna go. I'm gonna just bounce off. One more. There's a few. I'm gonna name drop a few really quick.
I'm gonna force you to say one.
You can't stop me. I'm gonna say something really quickly, and then I'll talk about one. Listen to Stick and Poke. Listen to Grace Petrie. Listen to Apes of the State. Listen to Mary Wander. Listen to Bridge City Centers. Okay, I'm gonna talk about Happy Happy though. Happy Happy is a folk punk artist. One guy needs way more recognition on Spotify because his shit is the best. Probably leans more in the punk. Like, it's funny. It's one of those artists. He's one of those artists where it's like, oh, this is more so like acoustic punk music than it is folk music. But the method of production, in the one personness behind it all, and the very lo-fi aesthetic,
very Daniel
is
Johnston,
like,
kind of esque.
Yeah, and I mean, I would not say he sounds like Daniel Johnston, but in terms of that whole like production, yeah, no, absolutely. It's like, oh no, this has to be. It's folk music by default because of that, right?
Yes.
And just excellent lyrics that span from the personal to the cosmic,
right.
And a lot of Happy Happy songs use a doubling effect on the vocals that is just extremely pleasing to hear. And just some very wonderful lyrics like "And you were the brave little toaster, but I was a regular toaster."
And you were the brave little toaster, and I was the regular
toaster.
That's fucking genius. And
I feel like there was some drugs involved with that.
That little LSD. That is. I hate how genius that is when I'm writing music. I just hate how that's so genius.
It's like, what'd you say?
No, I'm laughing.
No, yeah, because when you or I are writing music, it's like, okay, we're gonna work on this lyric, we're gonna make this sound, and then you realize 3 days later, oh no, that's pretentious as hell.
Yeah.
And then you listen, and you're like, and you were the brave little toaster, but I was a regular toaster, and you're like, oh, that's all I had to do. That's all. But there's also lines like looks like I love you like NPR loves the Postal Service.
Oh.
Or
Happy Happy, right? That's the name of this band.
Happy Happy, all one word. Happy Happy. Like everyone else that I've mentioned, you might like kind of come across on your own, especially the ones that I took some time on. But you won't with Happy Happy, and I highly recommend you check them out.
Now, out of these 3 artists you just list, how many do you think were like under the influence during the creation process?
Well, I mean, it depends on the album and the song,
that's
probably.
True.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say like Mischief Brew was definitely not on drugs, but it's probably very sad and drunk. Phil Oakes might have been on a lot of drugs. I don't know. I don't want to put that in the Phil Oakes. Happy Happy is on antidepressants at least, but is very good.
I love it. I love it. All right, well,
Nice.
thank you, Scott. Thank you for tuning
Thanks
in.
for having me on.
Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for inviting me. I had a lot of fun here.
Yeah,
Anytime.
it was a very good time. Mr. Jar Jar Binks.
Oh my god.
Nope, you can't do that.
Oh god.
Is that not that's not allowed?
You should make a song about that.
No,
like,
it's not
What would be a
Jar Jar
worse?
Binks.
What would be a worse accent to know how to do? Because it
I'm
sucks
not
'cause
even
I'm good at it.
going.
You know what I'm saying?
I'm not even gonna start pitching them because then you'll try them.
No,
Oh, yeah.
I swear I
I
will.
say,
Bill Cosby. That would be horrible. Like,
see,
imagine
that's
being-
what I'm saying.
Imagine being someone who's really good at a Bill Cosby accent before all the shit happened, and then now
it
it's
reminds
like,
me. It reminds me of there was this guy in the early 1960s, and his whole thing was that he did stand-up comedy based on the Kennedys, and he had a really good JFK impression. And then JFK got shot in the fucking head, and this guy's career tanked because no one wanted to hear Kennedy comedy anymore when he was dead.
Right, exactly. Well,
So
that's
suddenly
why-
his sort of satiric, sharp takes went very out of vogue.
Right. It's the lost accent, never to be used.
Never to be used.
No, please don't say it again. Turn it around, tie it and then throw it overboard. Like when you were a child, playing dangerous and running wild. Nobody told me